in the heart of New York, where skyscrapers touch the sky and dreams are forged in gold. A seemingly perfect family hid secrets as dark as the shadows that hang over the city at dusk. Richard Blackwood, a business titan, his wife Elizabeth, a renowned designer, and Sophia, Elizabeth's daughter from a previous marriage, were the envy of high society. But behind the smiles for the cameras and the closed doors of his mansion in the suburbs, a web of lies, passion, and betrayal was woven that would soon explode into a crime that would shake the foundations of the city that never sleeps. What drives a successful man to risk everything for a forbidden passion? How far can a betrayed woman go in her quest for revenge? And in the midst of this whirlwind of emotions, what role does a young woman caught between love and family loyalty play? On the night of September 15th, a gunshot breaks the stillness of the night in the luxurious neighborhood of Westchester. The neighbors, accustomed to the tranquility of its tree-lined streets and dream mansions, wake up with a start. Some look out the windows, others call the police. No one imagines that they are witnessing the outcome of a drama that has been brewing for months. When officers arrive at the Blackwood residence, an imposing Georgian-style structure with white columns and meticulously manicured gardens, they encounter a scene straight out of a thriller. The front door is ajar, the hall lights flickering ominously. In the second-floor office, lying on a priceless Persian rug, lies the lifeless body of Richard Blackwood. Chief Detective Jack Rodriguez, a 20-year homicide veteran, leans over the body. The cause of death is obvious: a single, accurate shot straight to the heart. The shocked expression frozen on Richard's face suggests he knew his killer. There are no signs of a struggle, no broken windows or jumbled drawers. This was not a robbery gone wrong. Elizabeth Blackwood is found in the master bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring into space and shaking hands. Dressed in a black silk nightgown, she appears to be an ethereal figure, almost unreal in the midst of the chaos. When Detective Rodriguez tries to question her, she can barely speak a word. Just repeat over and over again, "He's gone. He's finally gone." Sophia's absence from the crime scene is conspicuous. The agents search the house, but there is no sign of the 23-year-old girl. His room, decorated with photos of exotic trips and horse riding trophies, is empty. The bed is made as if no one had ever slept in it. As dawn breaks and the first rays of the sun illuminate the crime scene, investigators begin to unravel the complex web of relationships that existed in the Blackwood family. The neighbors, initially reluctant to talk, begin to share rumors and observations. They speak of frequent shouting, of cars arriving and leaving late at night, of a palpable tension that seemed to grow day by day. Detective Sarah Martinez, newly promoted to the homicide department, joins the investigation. Your instinct, sharp and precise, tells you that there is more to this story than meets the eye. As you review the opening statements, you notice subtle discrepancies, details that don't add up. Richard's phone records reveal a series of frequent calls to an unknown number, all done at unusual times, all deleted from the phone's history, but recovered thanks to the expertise of the technical team. Who was the recipient of these calls? What secrets did those conversations keep? Elizabeth, once recovered from the initial shock, begins to speak. His story is a mixture of love, disappointment, and resignation. He describes Richard as a brilliant but complex man, capable of great tenderness, but also a disconcerting coldness. He talks about how his marriage, once full of passion and complicity, had cooled over the years. Lately, he says, his voice breaking, it's been like living with a stranger. The investigation takes an unexpected turn when it is discovered that Richard had been diverting large sums of money from his company to an offshore account. The amounts are astronomical. Millions of dollars accumulated over months. Was he planning to run away? Or was he the victim of blackmail? Sophia finally appears, 24 hours after the murder. She arrives at the police station accompanied by her lawyer, a stern-looking man with an impeccable suit. Her opening statement is brief and seemingly solid. She was at a party in Manhattan, surrounded by friends who can corroborate her alibi. However, Detective Martinez notices something in his behavior, an underlying tension that doesn't fit with his story. As the days go by, the image of the perfect family falls apart piece by piece. It is discovered that Elizabeth had hired a private investigator weeks before the murder. Detective Rodriguez manages to locate the investigator, a former police officer named Mike Donovan. At first, Donovan is reluctant to speak, citing client confidentiality. But faced with the threat of obstruction of justice, he finally relents. Donovan's revelations are explosive. He had followed Richard for weeks, documenting his every move. The photos he gives to the police show Richard in compromising situations with a young woman. The meetings took place in discreet hotels, restaurants far from the usual circuit of New York high society. But the most shocking thing is not the infidelity itself, but the identity of the lover. The woman in the photos is Sophia. The news falls like a bomb on the police department. Suddenly, the seemingly complicated case turns into a labyrinth of intersecting motivations and broken loyalties. Detective Martinez, known for her ability to remain calm in the most tense situations, feels the ground shifting beneath her feet. Elizabeth is called to testify again. This time, his composure completely crumbles. Through tears, he confesses to having discovered the affair weeks before the murder. He describes the moment Donovan handed him the photos, how he felt like his world was collapsing around him. "I wasn't just betraying me," he says with a mixture of pain and anger. "I was corrupting my daughter, my own blood." Sophia, confronted with the evidence, finally admits to the relationship. His story is a mixture of remorse and justification. He talks about how what started as a forbidden attraction turned into a mutual obsession. Richard, she says, promised her a future together, far from New York, far from the accusatory glances and the whispers behind her back. "We were going to start over," Sophia says, with a look that mixes longing and guilt. "Somewhere where no one knew us, where we could just be Richard and Sophia, without labels, without a past." The investigation takes a new direction. It's no longer just about finding out who pulled the trigger, but about unraveling a complex web of lies and betrayal that extends far beyond the night of the murder. Investigators delve into the life of Richard Blackwood. They interview business partners, former employees, childhood friends. A portrait of a brilliant but deeply conflicted man emerges. From a young age, Richard had shown excessive ambition, a thirst for success that took him to the top of the business world. But that same drive that made him succeed in business made him a disaster personally. A former associate, speaking on condition of anonymity, describes Richard as an emotional predator. "I was always looking for the next conquest," he says. In business, in love, in life, nothing was enough for him. Elizabeth, for her part, begins to reveal a history of psychological abuse that spanned years. She talks about how Richard gradually isolated her from friends and family, how he controlled every aspect of her life under the guise of concern and love. "It made me doubt myself," she confesses in a particularly emotional session. "I came to think that I was crazy, that I was imagining things." The relationship between Richard and Sophia becomes the center of the investigation. The detectives reconstruct their story, from the first tense moments when Richard married Elizabeth to the furtive encounters in recent months. They interview Sophia's college classmates, employees of the hotels where they were staying, even a therapist Sophia had secretly visited. The therapist, freed from professional secrecy due to the seriousness of the case, speaks of a Sophia tormented by guilt but unable to break the bond with Richard. He described their relationship as an addiction, the therapist says. He knew it was wrong, that he was destroying his family, but he couldn't leave it. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of the murder weapon yields surprising results. Prints of both Elizabeth and Sophia are found on the gun. This discovery unleashes a new round of interrogations, each one more intense than the last. Elizabeth, confronted with the evidence, finally confesses to finding the gun in Richard's office on the night of the murder. "It was there, on his desk," he says, his voice shaking, "as if he were calling me." Sophia, for her part, admits to touching the gun after the shot. "I panicked," she says between sobs. "I didn't know what to do. I just wanted it all to go away." As the investigation nears its climax, Detective Martinez begins to put together the pieces of the puzzle. The night of the murder takes shape in his mind, a sequence of events driven by years of resentment, betrayal, and forbidden passions. Richard had planned to flee that night. The suitcases found in his car, full of clothes and documents, confirmed this. But something went wrong. Someone discovered it. In a final reconstruction of the events, based on the confessions and evidence collected, the truth emerges in all its tragic complexity. Elizabeth had discovered Richard and Sophia's escape plan. She confronted her husband in his office, armed with the private investigator's photos and years of pent-up rage. The argument escalated quickly. Richard, cornered, admitted everything: his affair with Sophia, their plan to run away together, the money he had been embezzling. In a moment of blind fury, Elizabeth grabbed the gun from Richard's desk and fired. A single shot, straight to the heart. Sophia, attracted by the noise, entered the office just after the shot. He saw his mother with the gun in her hand. Richard collapsed on the ground. At that moment, mother and daughter looked at each other, and in that look they said everything that words could not express. Together, united by shock and a twisted sense of family loyalty, they decided to cover up the crime. Sophia helped hide the gun in the garden, leaving her fingerprints in the process. Elizabeth locked herself in the bedroom, preparing to play the role of the shocked wife. The Blackwood case shocks New York society and becomes international news. The headlines speak of forbidden passion, of family betrayal, of a business empire built on lies. Television shows, podcasts, and books analyze every detail of the case, seeking to understand how a seemingly perfect family could fall apart so spectacularly. Elizabeth Blackwood is convicted of second-degree murder. His defense alleges years of emotional abuse and a moment of temporary insanity. He receives a sentence of 20 years, with the possibility of parole after 12. Sophia faces charges of accessory after the fact. His youth and his therapist's testimony about his mental state at the time of the events work in his favor. She is sentenced to 5 years, of which she will serve 3 in prison and 2 on parole. Richard Blackwood's business empire crumbles amid investigations into fraud and embezzlement. Partners and employees are struggling to distance themselves from the scandal as federal regulators sift through every transaction in search of more irregularities. Years later, the Blackwood case remains a topic of debate and fascination. It becomes a case study in law and psychology schools, an example of how appearances can be deceiving and how family secrets can have devastating consequences. For detectives Rodriguez and Martinez, the Blackwood case marks a before and after in their careers. Rodriguez, close to retirement, considers it the most complex case of his life. Martinez, for her part, is promoted and becomes one of the most respected investigators in the department. The Blackwood mansion, the scene of so much tragedy, remains empty for years. Neighbors talk about strange lights in the windows, about shadows that move when no one is inside. Finally, it is sold at a price well below its real value. The new owners tear it down and build a new house, as if they wanted to erase all traces of the tragedy that occurred there. But on the streets of New York, in office hallways and at social gatherings, the name Blackwood continues to resonate. It becomes synonymous with betrayal, a reminder of how lies, no matter how small at first, can grow until they destroy everything in their path. The story of the Blackwoods becomes an urban legend, a cautionary tale that parents tell their children, that lovers whisper in moments of doubt. It is a constant reminder that even in the highest circles of society, the most basic human passions can unleash storms that can destroy everything. Elizabeth, from her cell at Bedford Hills Women's Prison, begins writing her memoirs. The manuscript, leaked to the press, causes a sensation. In it, she describes her life with Richard as a gilded cage, a hell of luxury and appearances where love had long since withered. She talks about how, little by little, she lost her identity, becoming just another accessory in the life of her ambitious husband. Sophia, for her part, undergoes intense therapy during her time in prison. Gradually, she begins to understand the manipulation she was subjected to by Richard. In group sessions, she shares her story as a warning to other vulnerable young women. Their testimony becomes part of a program to prevent abuse in unequal power relationships. The Blackwood case also has repercussions in the business world. New regulations are implemented to prevent the type of financial fraud Richard had been committing. Companies are forced to increase their transparency and accountability measures. In the Westchester neighborhood, the Blackwood's absence leaves a void that takes time to fill. The neighbors, previously envious of its apparent perfection, now reflect on appearances and the reality that hides behind the impeccable facades. 5 years after the crime, Detective Sarah Martinez visits Elizabeth in prison. The once elegant designer has aged prematurely, but there is a calmness in her eyes that wasn't there before. "Was it worth it?" asks Martinez. Elizabeth is silent for a long moment before answering. The truth always finds its way to the light. "I only accelerated the process." Sophia, already on parole, tries to rebuild her life away from New York. He moves to a small town on the West Coast where no one knows his past. She begins working at a non-profit organization that helps abused women. Their experience, although painful, becomes a tool to help others. Detective Jack Rodriguez, now retired, occasionally gives lectures on the case at police academies. "In my 40-year career," he often says, "I have never seen a case that so clearly illustrates how the decisions we make, no matter how small they may seem, can have consequences that go far beyond ourselves." As the years go by, the Blackwood case becomes the subject of documentaries, books, and even a television series. Each new interpretation adds layers to the story, exploring the nuances of human psychology, family dynamics, and social pressures that led to this tragedy. In an irony of fate, the Blackwood fortune, once a symbol of their success and power, ends up being donated to charities fighting domestic abuse and human trafficking. The name, once synonymous with scandal, now appears on the license plates of women's shelters and help centers. The story of the Blackwoods becomes a mirror in which society looks at itself, forcing it to confront its own demons. How many other seemingly perfect families hide equally dark secrets? How many Elizabeths, Richards, and Sophias are out there, trapped in cycles of abuse, manipulation, and betrayal? The case also sparks debates about the nature of forgiveness and redemption. Can a person who has committed such a terrible act find peace? Can a family torn apart by betrayal be reunited? 20 years after the crime, Sophia and Elizabeth meet again for the first time since the trial. The meeting, which takes place in a neutral park, far from the memories of his old life, is tense and emotional. Mother and daughter, united by blood and separated by tragedy, try to rebuild a bridge over the abyss that separates them. "I'm sorry," Sophia says, tears welling in her eyes. Throughout, Elizabeth, with her face marked by years and sorrow, takes her daughter's hand. "Me too," he replies. "We were both victims in our own way." This meeting, far from being a happy ending, marks the beginning of a long and painful healing process. Both Elizabeth and Sophia know that they will never be able to erase the past, but perhaps, with time and effort, they can build a future in which Richard Blackwood's shadow does not darken everything. The story of the Blackwoods thus becomes a lasting reminder of the fragility of human relationships, of how love can transform into its opposite, and of how, sometimes, the most important decisions in our lives are made in moments of passion and despair. As the years go by, the Blackwood case continues to resonate in society, generating new reflections and debates. In universities, it becomes a recurring topic of study in the faculties of psychology, law, and sociology. Students analyze every aspect of the case, from the toxic family dynamics to the legal and ethical implications of each family member's actions. In the world of art, the Blackwood tragedy inspires numerous works. A Broadway playwright premieres a play that explores events from the perspective of the three protagonists, showing how the same reality can be perceived in such different ways. The play becomes a critical and popular success, winning several Tony Awards and sparking conversations about the nature of truth and perception. A renowned film director decides to bring the story to the big screen. The film, starring renowned actors, becomes a cultural phenomenon. It explores not only the events leading up to the murder, but also its long-term consequences. The final scene, which shows Elizabeth and Sophia trying to rebuild their relationship years later, leaves viewers with a lump in their throat and a multitude of unanswered questions. In the realm of literature, several books explore different angles of the story. An investigative journalist publishes an exhaustive biography of Richard Blackwood, revealing details from his childhood and youth that shed new light on his actions. Another book, written by a forensic psychologist, analyzes the psychological profile of Elizabeth, Sophia, and Richard, trying to understand what led each to act as they did. The impact of the case on the business world also endures. The new regulations implemented following the discovery of Richard's fraud are informally known as the Blackwood Laws. These measures, which demand greater transparency and accountability in large corporations, become a global standard, influencing the way business is done around the world. In the legal field, the Blackwood case is frequently cited in lawsuits involving domestic violence and psychological abuse. Defense attorneys use Elizabeth's example to argue how years of emotional abuse can drive a person to commit desperate acts. On the other hand, prosecutors use it as an example of how vigilante justice is never the answer, no matter how difficult the circumstances. The story also has a lasting impact on the Westchester community. The land where the Blackwood Mansion once stood remains vacant for years, becoming something of an unofficial monument to the tragedy. Finally, at the initiative of the neighbors, it is transformed into a small park dedicated to victims of domestic violence. In the center of the park, a plaque reminds visitors that appearances can be deceiving and that it is important to be alert for signs of abuse in our environment. Sophia, in the years following her release, becomes a leading voice in the fight against abuse in unequal power relationships. He gives talks at universities and high schools, sharing his experience and warning about the dangers of emotional manipulation. Her personal story, although painful, becomes a powerful tool to raise awareness and prevent other young women from falling into similar situations. Elizabeth, for her part, finds a form of redemption through art. During his time in prison, he rediscovers his passion for design and begins creating intricate textile works. His creations, which reflect the complexity of his emotions and experiences, are exhibited in an art gallery in Manhattan. The exhibition, titled Threads of a Frayed Life, receives critical praise and becomes an unexpected success. The reunion between Elizabeth and Sophia, 20 years after the crime, is not the end of their story, but the beginning of a new chapter. Both women, marked by the past but determined not to be defined solely by it, begin a long and difficult process of reconciliation. They attend therapy together, facing the ghosts of the past and learning to forgive themselves and each other. This healing process becomes the subject of a moving documentary that follows mother and daughter over several years. The film, which shows moments of intense pain but also of hope and growth, becomes a viral phenomenon, inspiring thousands of broken families to seek reconciliation. The Blackwood story also has a lasting impact on the way society views family and couple relationships. Educational programs are implemented in high schools to teach youth about healthy relationships and how to recognize signs of abuse. Domestic violence helplines are seeing a significant increase in calls as more people are encouraged to seek help. In the world of fashion and interior design, industries in which Elizabeth once shined, her story becomes a constant reminder that professional success does not always translate into personal happiness. Several designers dedicate collections to the silent strength of women who face adversity hidden behind facades of perfection. As society evolves, the Blackwood case remains a reference point for discussions about gender, power, and justice. In debates about reforms to the judicial system, it is frequently cited as an example of the complexity of certain cases and the need to consider factors such as prolonged abuse of legal processes. 30 years after the crime, a new generation discovers the story of the Blackwoods through a true crime podcast that goes viral. The podcast, which combines journalistic investigation with dramatizations, introduces the case to millions of young listeners, generating new conversations about topics such as consent, power dynamics in relationships, and ethics in business. On the 30th anniversary of the murder, a symposium is organized at Columbia University to discuss the long-term impact of the Blackwood case on various aspects of society. Experts in law, psychology, sociology, and ethics debate the lessons learned and changes implemented as a direct or indirect result of this tragedy. Sophia, now in her 50s, is invited as a keynote speaker. Her emotional and thoughtful speech touches on themes of forgiveness, personal growth, and the importance of breaking cycles of abuse. Each of us, he says, has the power to choose a different path, to break the destructive patterns that have been handed down to us. My family's tragedy does not have to be the end of the story, but the beginning of a positive change. Elizabeth, who is attending the event from the audience, listens to her daughter's words with tears in her eyes. At the end of the speech, mother and daughter embrace on stage, a powerful image that symbolizes the possibility of healing even after the deepest wounds. This moment becomes an iconic image, reproduced in newspapers and social networks around the world. For many, it represents the culmination of a long journey of pain, regret, and ultimately redemption. The Blackwood story, with all its complexities and contradictions, becomes a mirror in which society looks at itself, forcing itself to confront uncomfortable truths about love, power, ambition, and human nature. It reminds us that behind every sensational headline, every media scandal, there are real human beings with their struggles, their mistakes, and their capacity for change. Ultimately, the legacy of the Blackwood case transcends the crime itself. It becomes a modern parable about the power of truth, the consequences of our actions, and the ever-present possibility of redemption. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments, there is the possibility of light, forgiveness, and a new beginning. As New York City continues to move forward, always changing and always the same, the story of the Blackwoods remains a whisper in its streets, an echo in its skyscrapers, a reminder that behind every illuminated window, there may be a love story of hate, betrayal, or redemption, and that, in the end, we are all capable of the best and the worst. We are all human, fragile, and strong, trapped in the eternal struggle between our desires and our duties, our instincts and our morals. The Blackwood Mansion no longer exists, but its history lives on, a testament to how a single decision can unleash a storm that destroys everything in its path, and how, even after the most devastating storm, there is always the possibility of to rebuild, to heal, to start again.